Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cashflow King with you today, and today in episode 14, got I-bonds? What the hell's an I-bond? Well, before we get into that, a couple of quick announcements. First of all, I am recording today with my new weird-looking pop filter. I noticed when I was editing a lot of the podcasts that you could hear my breathing a lot. Perhaps you can still hear them in the episodes, but I end up having to edit a lot of breathing out. And so I kind of felt like even though I had the foam protector over the microphone, it wasn't quite enough. So lo and behold, the pop filter, we'll see how this fucking thing works out. But hopefully the sound quality is a little bit better for you guys. Getting real fancy over here at Real Talk Personal Finance these days. All right, a couple shout outs before we jump into the episode. First, I would like to thank our new listeners in Germany. We now have Germany on the map. And also, for those in the U.S., we have Indianapolis, Indiana, and New York coming up on the listenership rankings. So thank you to everybody in those locations, and thank you to all of our listeners. We certainly appreciate you. And if you appreciate the show and think we've earned it and have done a good job, please consider leaving a 5-star review and rating. We would greatly appreciate it. All right, so episode number 14, got I-bonds. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit first about something which we may have touched on briefly in some of the previous episodes, and we won't spend too much time on it today, but the idea of what is a nominal return and what is a real return, and what's the difference between the two, nominal versus real returns. So a lot of times I'll have this conversation with clients too, especially if somebody's super conservative with their investments. Let's say somebody has a bunch of money in some sort of a fixed account, for example, and they're earning a particular interest rate, whatever that rate might be. They can easily point to their statement and show you that, hey, my account value went up from last statement until this statement, and here's how much I've earned. That's a nominal return, which basically means in name only. So let's say, hypothetically, somebody earned a 3% fixed return, or 3% return of any kind for that matter. That would be a nominal return, but then when you adjust that number for inflation, especially in recent times, and hence one of the reasons we're going to be doing today's show in an inflationary environment now that we find ourselves in, when you factor that in, the real return oftentimes could be negative. So if I'm just going to make up a couple numbers here, we'll stick with the 3% nominal return. Let's say inflation was closer to, we'll call it 7%. Then the real rate of return for that particular person over that particular time frame would be a -4. So they got 3% nominal, but then once you back out 7 for inflation, their real return would be a -4%, which obviously isn't all that appetizing, but it's something that a lot of people really don't think all that much about. They're just used to looking at their investment returns in nominal terms only. So that's just an important consideration and thing to be aware of. So as I mentioned, and it's probably no surprise to any of you that we are in a pretty low interest rate environment today. Although rates are starting to tick up, we're recording the show today on April 22nd, 2022. So depending on when you listen to this, things could be a little bit different at that time. But we are seeing interest rates continue to creep up a little bit. And so one of the things that seems to have gotten a lot of attention in recent times is the idea of an I-bond. And so I thought it would be a good idea to do a quick podcast about I-bonds and kind of give you a crash course on what the fuck is everybody talking about and why is this a big deal and is it something I should consider. So that's pretty much the goal of today's show. If we first think about bonds in general and the role that they might play in somebody's portfolio, you're going to have them for potentially several different reasons, but two of the more common ones are going to be some sort of stability. Especially if we're talking about, let's say, a stock market-based portfolio where you have a portion that's in equities or stocks and another portion that's in fixed income or bonds. The bond component is ideally supposed to provide some overall stability to that portfolio in terms of value. And also, it's supposed to provide some sort of income in a lot of cases. And again, it's no secret or surprise right now that maybe it's providing a little bit of stability, but you can make an argument that as rates continue to go up, the value of most types of bonds and bond funds will decline simply because there's an inverse relationship between the two. So that's kind of strike one. And then when you look at it from an income standpoint, the reality is that most bonds in today's environment are really not yielding all that much. They're really not producing any substantial amount of income to write home about. And so this isn't to say that you shouldn't have bonds or fixed income in a portfolio. There's other solutions and potential ideas and ways to replace a certain portion of a bond allocation. We're not going to get into any of that shit today, but it is worth mentioning that that is generally the role of bonds. And I can't remember the gentleman's name, but there's somebody in financial services one time, and I thought this was pretty fantastic. They pretty much said that bonds is where money goes to die, essentially, because you really don't have particularly all that much upside on certain types of fixed income investments. Again, not always going to be the case. There are people that have done very well with certain types of fixed income, particularly in the interest rate environment that we were in previously, where rates kind of edged down a little bit. A lot of people saw that their fixed income portions of their portfolio may have appreciated. But anyway, that's all sort of beyond the scope, I guess, of today's show. We're not going to spend too much time on that. But the point is, most people are not purchasing bonds of any kind because they're trying to knock it out of the park. That's the bottom line that I'm trying to get to there. However, like I said, it doesn't mean that they may not have their place in a portfolio. Now, what we're going to talk about in today's show is an I bond, which I've mentioned a couple of times now. So we're going to go ahead and define what that is. An I bond is a U.S. Series I savings bond that's issued by the Treasury Department, and it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So it's a virtually risk-free security from that standpoint, unless the U.S. government defaults somehow, which everybody's going to have an opinion. Personally, I don't see that happening, but that's a conversation for another day. Let's talk about some of the details of these I bonds and where they might fit. The first thing to know is that this is not something that you are going to be able to purchase inside of a retirement account. So for those of you that may be listening from that perspective, you're probably going to want to look elsewhere for your fixed income exposure. But these are generally going to be purchased in a taxable form. And it's not something that, again, you can buy from a brokerage or, as in the form of a mutual fund or an ETF. There are certain other types of securities that you can do that with. We're not going to talk about those today. But for I bonds specifically, it is something that's issued by the Treasury. And we'll talk at the end of the show on exactly how you go about purchasing them if you decide that that makes sense for your situation. But first, let's talk a little bit more about them, what they are, how they work, and kind of what's going on right now, why all the hype. So there are two components when it comes to essentially an interest rate on an I bond. And the first component is the fixed, I like to call it the base rate, but it's the fixed interest rate, which right now, as at the time of this recording, April 22nd, 2022, is zero. And it's been zero for a little while now. And you might think, well, why the fuck would I ever put money in something at 0%? Well, hold on there, buddy. That's only half of the return that we're going to be talking about, or the interest rate that we're going to be talking about. The second part is the inflation rate, which adjusts every 6 months. So they're going to declare a new rate every 6 months, and rates are declared on the first business day of May and of November each year. Okay, so right now, at the time of this recording, the inflation rate is 7.12%. Now, it's the end of April. They're getting ready to declare again, coming up here in just about a week or so, a little more than that. In May, they're going to declare another inflation rate, and there's a lot of speculation and articles and people talking about what that rate might be. The prediction seems to be across the board from most sources right now that it could be going up to as much as 9.62%. Again, that's not something that's been officially released or final. Based on when you're listening to this, if you're listening to this after the first business day in May, you can certainly look that up pretty easily. But if you're listening to this when it first comes out at the end of April, we don't yet know for sure what that's going to be, but there's some speculation out there and some educated guesses that based on recent inflation numbers, it's going to be 9.62%. But that's the inflation rate component. So the fixed interest rate is zero. The inflation rate currently 7.12, potentially going up to 9.62. And that is based on the CPIU, which is the Consumer Price Index for Urban Consumers. That's how they're getting these numbers. So when you combine those two, 0 plus the fixed rate plus the inflation rate, so 0 plus 7.12 or potentially 0 plus 9.62, those two numbers combined is going to give you your composite rate. That's actually the annualized rate that you will earn if you decide to purchase an I bond. So you're going to combine those two to get that number. The bonds will earn at that particular rate for 6 months from the first of that particular month. And I'll give you an example here coming up shortly. But it's going to earn that rate for the initial 6 months that you own it. And then it's going to earn a new rate, unless the rate happens to stay the same. But generally, it's going to be a new different rate. In this case, hopefully a higher rate for the following 6 months. So I mentioned this on the last show with Cube Crusher. We didn't talk too much about it. We're going to talk a little bit more about it today in terms of I-bonds. I actually never thought I would purchase a bond in the foreseeable future, but I decided to go ahead and do that. So I'll give you an example, a personal example here, where back in December, towards the end of December of 2021, I went ahead and purchased some I-bonds. And I bought those at the end of December. However, the effective date of the purchase reverts to that first of that month, so December 1st. And back at that time, and this is still true today, currently on April 22nd of 2022, the base rate, or the fixed interest rate, is 0. The inflation rate is and was 7.12%. So my composite rate, 0 plus 7.12, is obviously 7.12. That's the yield, the annualized yield that I will earn on those funds and have been earning on those funds. So that's going to be the case through May of 2022. So remember, I bought it in December of last year, so 6 months later is going to carry us through May of this year, 2022. All right, and then it's going to earn a new rate starting in June. So the new rate itself, they're always declared in November and May. All right, so it was declared in November. 7.12 was declared back in November last year of 2021. I didn't make the purchase till December. So I'm going to get that 7.12% annualized yield for 6 months from when I bought it in December, which carries me through May. And then in May, they're going to go ahead and declare the new rate, again, potentially 9.62. And starting in June, after my first 6 month window at the 7.12, starting in June for the next 6 months, I would go ahead and earn whatever that new rate is. Again, the fixed rate of 0 is not going to change for the life of the bond. So once you purchase it, it's always going to remain at 0. But the part that does change is that inflation rate. So I could end up getting, let's say, 9.62, or the equivalent of that annualized yield for the following 6 months. And that's essentially how it's going to work, right? So that new rate is going to be earned in June, July, August, September, October, November. Again, that next 6 months. And then in December of this year, 2022, through May of 2023, I will then earn whatever the new rate is that got declared in November, right? So May and November, it's always declared, and then you're going to earn for 6 months the annualized yield. You're going to earn that for 6 months from when you purchase the bond, right? Effective on the first day of the month that you purchased the bond, and then the following 6 months, again, that rate will be reset. So that's essentially how it's going to work, and then that will be earned and continue on that way basically every 6 months. So it might be a little confusing. You may have to go back and listen to that part again. It's really not that bad, right? I mean, essentially it's going to change every 6 months in terms of what you're earning. These are 30-year bonds, and there is a 1-year minimum hold, except for the case of a federally declared disaster, which is rare. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But it is a 1-year minimum hold. So if there's any chance that you might need these funds within the first year, you probably shouldn't put that money into an I-bond, okay? There is a 5-year minimum hold if you don't want to pay a penalty. So it's a 30-year bond, okay? You absolutely can't take any of your money back in the first year unless there's a federally declared disaster. So it's a 1-year hold minimum. After that, if you decide to redeem it between 1 and 5 years, you will simply just forfeit the last 3 months of interest as a penalty. So if you had it, say, for 2.5 years, and then you want to redeem it, well, obviously 2.5 is longer than 1 year, but it's not quite 5 years. So they're going to go ahead, and when they redeem that bond from you, they will basically give you back everything plus all the interest that's been accrued and earned, with the exception of the last 3 months of interest. They will withhold that as a penalty. Sounds probably worse than it is, but if you do hold it for at least 5 years, then you don't have to worry about that 3 months, the final 3 months of interest as a penalty. So if you had it for, let's say 5 or 6 years, then it's just going to redeem at face value at that point. So you don't have to hold it for 30 years. Some people out there will tell you that you should or shouldn't. Again, we don't give advice on this show. That's for you to figure out and decide depending on how you want to look at this. I'll give you a couple examples towards the end of different ways that I would be thinking about it. But, that's essentially how it works. So 1 year hold, years 1 through 5 if you redeem, 3 month penalty on the last 3 months of interest. If you hold it for 5 years, no penalty after that, and you can hold it as long as 30 years if you wanted to. And again, in May and November, they're going to go ahead and declare those new rates as far as the inflation rate goes, and then that's the annualized equivalent rate that you would earn for the next 6 months. Another cool thing about these is that you will pay federal taxes only. Again, we don't give tax, legal, financial, or any other advice on the show, so that's my disclaimer. This is for education and entertainment purposes only, but this is how they work. So you would pay federal taxes only on the interest earned at the time of redemption typically, and you will not pay state or local taxes, unlike some other types of investments or bonds that you may be interested in. So that's kind of a neat little thing about that. I want to discuss really briefly how I-bonds might interact with larger emergency funds. So we did an episode titled What Level is Your Emergency Fund? If you haven't checked that out, feel free to go back and listen to that. Everyone's going to think about emergency funds differently. I have my views, Cube Crusher has his views, and you may have your own views, and that's great. But when we're talking about emergency fund in and of itself, you obviously don't want to take, like if you're looking at a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, for example, and that's all you have, this is not the place for that money, clearly, right? But there's some people, myself included, as we talked about a lot on episode 13 with the cash flow investing versus growth investing featuring Cube Crusher, I generally like to have a fairly large and healthy cash allocation from an emergency standpoint and just in general for many different reasons that were discussed on that episode, so we won't rehash that here. But I know there's going to be a portion of that I am not going to need for at least a 1 year time frame, right? So, but I still don't want it subject to certain types of investments. Let's say the volatility of the stock market, for example, okay? So that might be a piece or a slice or a layer of those funds that I want to go ahead and purchase some I-bonds with. And that's actually what I did in December. And I briefly alluded to this on the last episode, but what I'm kind of toying around with, and I haven't made a final definitive decision on this yet, but I'm thinking probably in June that I will go ahead and purchase another block of I-bonds at that time. And so that's one way to think about it for larger emergency funds where you may have a surplus of cash that you know you're not going to need inside of a year, and you're tired of your dog shit interest rate of 0.5%, 0.1%, 0.01%, or whatever your bank, credit union, or even your quote-unquote high-yield savings account is paying today. I know right now I have one that's paying 0.5%. Well, those funds are getting ready to get used, and that account's going to get closed, so I'm not overly worried about it. Obviously, that's no place for those funds to go in turn, like they would not be going into an I-bond, for example. But if you're going to have funds that are going to be sitting there even with a relatively short or midterm time horizon that you don't want subject to any type of market volatility, but you would like to earn a better yield, you might consider an I-bond for a portion of those funds or potentially all of those funds, depending on how much we're talking about, because there are some limits on these. The next point really quick, and then we'll do a worst case scenario, is how I-bonds might interact with upcoming larger purchases. The best example that I could think of, I was thinking about this earlier this morning, where somebody might want to do this is, let's say in today's market, you have a vehicle, and I would actually kind of place myself into this category. I hope it lasts for a lot longer, but it may not. If you have a vehicle that's getting older and maybe there's high mileage on it and you may start to have an issue or two here or there, and you think that in the relatively near future, and I'm not talking 2-3 weeks, but possibly 2-3 years or something like that, you might need to replace a vehicle, and you want to have some funds available, whether you choose to pay cash or you want it for a down payment or whatever your situation is. But again, you don't want to put that money in the market, because what happens if the market crashes or drops or we go into a recession and now all of a sudden you don't have what you needed or thought you were going to have? That's not a fun situation to be in, right? So you might consider utilizing an I-bond for that reason. So you might put a chunk in there and say, hey, look, I know, or I'm fairly certain that I'm not going to be purchasing a vehicle in the next year, but I might need one in the next 2, or I might need one in the next year and a half, or something like that, right? You're not in dire straits for a vehicle, but you know what might be coming up. Maybe you're kind of speculating on, okay, well, what's going to happen in this environment as far as the car market goes and vehicle prices and different shortages and inventory issues and things like that. Maybe you want to try to wait it out a little bit and not buy a vehicle right now and wait for things potentially to calm down a little bit. And you don't need a vehicle right now anyway, but you're probably going to need it in the next couple of years. I think an I-bond could be a great fit for those funds, because quite frankly, they probably shouldn't be in the stock market anyway, right? and you don't want to just put them in cash at pretty much zero. So what's another good alternative for that that's virtually risk-free? iBonds seem to fit the bill pretty well for that. So let's go over a worst case scenario as far as purchasing these and kind of talk through what that might look like, okay? And then we'll talk about where to purchase them and some limits and stuff like that. So worst case scenario, let's say you bought an iBond right now in April. We're at the end of April of 2022. So the rate hasn't changed yet, again, depending on when you're listening to this. So you buy it in April of 2022 at a 7.12% composite rate. That's the annualized yield that you'll earn on that bond for the next 6 months. So you buy it in April at 7.12% composite interest rate. You're going to earn the equivalent of an annualized 7.12% for the next 6 months. Then, and this is absolute worst case, unlikely, like world's coming to an end type of scenario. I don't foresee this happening at all, but I'm just giving you like absolute worst case scenario. There's one scenario that would be even worse than that, which is that the U.S. government defaults on these. But other than that, which you're not going to be concerned with your money, we're going to have way too many problems at that point if that's the case. But other than that, the second to worst case scenario is this. You buy it in April, 7.12% composite interest rate. You're going to earn the equivalent of that for the next 6 months. Then something crazy happens. In May, instead of the 9.62% that they're forecasting or anything in the ballpark that's close to that, in May of 2022, somehow, and again, I don't see this happening, but the inflation rate goes to zero, okay? So for the first 6 months, you're earning 7.12%. And then for the next 6 months, somehow something freaking crazy happens and you're earning zero, all right? You still got an effective rate of 3.56% for that 1 year. But wait, we're not done. What did we say before? Well, if we redeem between years 1 and 5, then what happens? Well, we would lose and have to subtract the final 3 months of interest. And so if we did that, you're still going to earn ballpark about 2.67% effective interest rate that you actually get to keep. That is excluded from state and local taxes, by the way, which is kind of nice. Where else could you get that type of a rate? And again, I think it's going to be way higher than that. I don't see any way that it would be anywhere near zero declared in May of 2022. But worst, I'm talking like pretty much worst case scenario, other than defaulting, the U.S. government defaulting, that's what it would be. There aren't too many places right now that I can think of that are virtually risk-free from a deposit type of standpoint that you're going to get 2.67%. Now, some people will talk about iBonds as an investment. I don't really view it as an investment. I view it as a cash alternative that's not going to be needed for at least a year. Okay, so it's something that's, again, short to midterm in nature, even though they're technically 30-year bonds, and you could argue you should buy it and hold it for 30 years, and therefore it's an investment. I'm not going to go down that road. Personally, I disagree with that viewpoint, but if you feel that way, that's totally fine, right? That's up to you to decide. But I'm looking at this as a short to sort of midterm type of place, a holding place for cash that has a little bit of a tax advantage. Nothing crazy because you're still going to pay the federal tax, but the rate is exceptional during this time period, okay, relative to other types of deposit type products, and it just has a little bit of liquidity limitations. Now, what did we talk about before? If I don't have them on the show today, so you guys might miss them. We got a lot of downloads on our shows that we've had with Cube Crusher and also Travel Queen. People seem to like the guests. I love having the guests, and so I'm sure we'll have both of them back on and potentially some other guests at some point as well. But Cube Crusher would probably be quick to tell you, hey, look, you talked about nominal versus real returns at the beginning of the show. Basically, your real return is zero. Like your nominal return might be 7.12, or if it goes up in May, it might be 9.62, whatever the number changes to after that. But that's based on inflation. So if that's the nominal return, but that's also the rate of inflation, then your real return is zero. And my response would be, yes, you are correct. However, what is the alternative? How many people have negative real returns because they have money that's sitting in a bank account getting less than 1%, 0.5%, less than 0.5%? That's what we're looking at as far as alternatives go. Again, I don't view this as an investment. So it's not like we're trying to knock it out of the park. We just want our cash to work a little bit harder for us, and we're okay with giving up a little bit of liquidity, at least for the first 12 months. And there was another show I was listening to where they were talking about a little hack in a way to basically do it in 11 months, and that is if you buy towards the end of a given month, like I mentioned, and I did this in December, the effective date is really the first of that particular month. So in essence, when you run it out over the course of that first year, you could redeem closer to like 11 months in one day if you timed it perfectly. And again, it's at that point, if you're that worried about 1 month or 30 days, you probably shouldn't have your money in I-bonds anyway, I would say. So just plan for that full year, but there is a little bit of a quote-unquote loophole, if you want to call it that there. All right, so that's what we're talking about. So where the hell do we get these things, and how much can we put in these things, and does it even make sense to do so? Well, the last question is for you to decide whether or not it makes sense for your situation. I can't tell you that. Where do you go to purchase an I-bond today? For most people, you're going to go to Treasury Direct. So that's treasurydirect.gov, G-O-V. And the website's kind of a shit show. I mean, it's really not all that user-friendly, but it's not as horrible as some people make it out to be. I've read some articles that really shit on it pretty good. And, for a government website, it's really not that bad, but it's a mild, we'll call it a mild shit show on a scale from 1 to 10. We'll give it like a 3.5 on the shit show scale, all right? But you can navigate through there. You can research, and there's FAQs, and you type in I-bonds in the search box. You can look at that. There's almost a tutorial that will show you how to open an account on there. It's really not all that difficult. But that's where you would go to purchase I-bonds. It's all done in electronic format if you're using treasurydirect.gov. So again, it's not something you're going to buy at your brokerage firm or through your financial advisor or anything like that. It's probably why your financial advisor hasn't told you about them. So anyway, that's where you would go, treasurydirect.gov, okay, to make that purchase. The limit is typically $10,000 per year per person in general. Now, there's some people talk about strategies to potentially buy more than that. You can buy them as gifts for children. You can buy them, believe it or not, with entities that have the same beneficial ownership. So you might buy some in your individual name. If you have, let's say, a revocable living trust, you may also be able to buy it in the name of the trust, even though you might be the beneficial owner of that trust. So there's some different creative ways and things that you can do, and you can check all that out on treasurydirect.gov and poke around. But in general, most people, it's going to be $10,000 per year per person. So, again, if you're a married couple, each of you can potentially do $10,000. Depending on when you're listening to this show, let's say you were listening to it in, November, December, and you could buy 10 and 10 then for $20,000, and then you turn around a few months later at the beginning of the following year, you can buy another 10 and 10 for $20,000, and you've effectively purchased $40,000 of I-bonds within a period of, a handful of months, for example. So, that's another possibility there. You can get up to $5,000 in paper I-bonds, and most of you have probably filed by now. We are after the initial tax filing deadline it was April 18th this year of 2022. Perhaps you filed an extension, so it may or may not be too late depending on your tax situation. But if you're getting a tax refund, you can request to get up to $5,000 of paper I-bonds essentially sent to you in lieu of that portion of your tax refund. So talk to your tax advisor about that. Again, we don't give tax or legal advice on the show, but that's a way to get an extra couple of bucks into some I-bonds if you want to. But I think for most people, the easiest thing to do is just to go to treasurydirect.gov, go ahead and find out or figure out how you'd like to take ownership. You can purchase up to $10,000 and kind of go from there. So that's pretty much the show for today about I-bonds on episode 14 called Got I-bonds. Thanks again to all of you for listening to the show and supporting the show. We really appreciate it. If you haven't already done so, please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review for the show. We would appreciate that as well. And if you found value in the show, also feel free to share it with your friends, family, coworkers, anybody that's not offended by a little bit of vulgarity, and help spread the word and see if they got some freaking I-bonds. That's all I have today. This is the Cash Flow King, episode 14, Got I-bonds. Thanks for listening. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.